Well, thanks everybody for coming in. This panel presentation is about a recent survey that we did with Relativity. So we being who I am with Special Counsel, who I can kind of do the shameless vendor plug, but work with Special Counsel and started the cybersecurity practice over there, where we do quite a bit of data breach review as well as proactive services. I've been doing IT services for close to 25 years, and the last 12 exclusively in cybersecurity. I've had roles in a number of different companies doing IR response primarily, I would say, over the past couple of years. So I certainly know what incident response and data breach looks like. I did probably 300 or led 300 investigations last year alone, from business email compromise, ransomware, web application hacks, you name it. And a lot of it ended up resulting in data breach review work, which kind of led me to where I am now, because that becomes something we'll talk about as well, is responding to a data breach to notification. What's that process look like, and where some of the struggles are, and the perceptions that IT and legal departments have. They're not always in line. So it's sometimes you might be talking to same people in one company, but they have completely different views of what's going on. So with the panel, I'm actually going to go in sitting order, but you have Chris Wasserman, who's Vice President, Regional Vice President here at Special Counsel with me out in New York, and Chris and I have known each other for a number of years, and Chris has led the teams doing that data breach review work for me on 100 matters now in the past 18 months, quite a bit. Then we have Rick Lucas, who's a partner at Safe Earth and Shaw out of San Francisco. And Amanda, see, like you maybe Fennell, is that am I saying it right?
You're awesome.
There we go. But I'll also let you guys just do quick introductions of yourself, because I hate doing the bio reading of people that are sitting here that can probably tell themselves better stories, tell better stories about themselves.
Start at the end, I'll close. Ladies first.
I guess
Ladies,
so.
ladies first.
I don't know that I have a whole lot to
Yeah.
say on that one. I do have a background that's heavily in cyber. Clearly, that's what you do with an archaeology degree, so it was a pretty easy route. So I was in cyber for several years in incident response. This is my background in my favorite area. And then since joining Relativity in January of 2018, it's been a real journey to really wrap that around with product security and compliance as well. So that's about it. I'm in cyber as well.
Hi everyone, Richard Lucas, partner at Safe Earth Shaw at San Francisco. My practice is essentially entirely cybersecurity and some e-discovery on the side when there's some more rather complex data issues. I'm an ethical hacker, forensic examiner, so kind of bring all that together for investigations, and typically my role is kind of the breach coach that sits between a client who's having the breach situation and any service providers that they have under their insurance or that we brought in under privilege or what other means. So typically I do a lot of translation between the client who's very anxious about what's going on, the service providers who's talking a different language sometimes that they don't understand, we'll get into that later, and also the insurance company who's paying for stuff. So that's kind of where I bring my experience from.
And I'm Chris Wasserman, like Doug said, Vice President at Special Counsel. I'm one of those service providers that he's talking about, and I'm the one speaking Greek to your clients, trying to explain to them. Not all the time. Well, actually, that's largely my role as well, is to be translator between the breach coach, breach counsel, IT, and our internal folks, a lot of which come from a legal or an IT background, and the cyber jargon is unique to those folks. But yeah, I'm usually the one getting the call after you do. So it's 4 p.m. on a Friday for you. It's usually 11 p.m. on that same Friday. But yeah, a lot of experience working through sort of the tail end. I don't dance a whole lot on the proactive side, but I can speak to what happens when there is no proactive measures in place, because I'm there to clean up the mess, and we're pretty much in the weeds on a daily basis, going through that information and trying to make heads or tails of it to meet regulatory requirements, which can get a little tricky, which you could probably speak to.
Wait for Manzetta. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to step through an overview of the IR process, because it's important to understand that there is a process in place and what it means and where each one of us get involved at different levels, and where you see it's kind of a team sport, because there's legal involved, there's IT involved, there's C-suite. I mean, you get a lot of people involved in this process, and there's some important steps that need to be followed. And then we're going to go through the survey again that we put out with Relativity on the types of perceptions that organizations have about their IT security from the legal and IT side. And we'll just kind of dig into those numbers as well. But I mentioned I just want to jump in briefly, and we're not going to kill you with a bunch of slides, but knowing what the IR process looks like. And it's presented as a waterfall that for the most part should be, but there are some changes where you can jump around, but you really don't want to basically skip too many steps. Where we want to see most of these efforts, and what we're going to talk about a little bit, is people's perception of really where they are in the kind of green and yellow boxes up there, somewhat to the containment and eradication. But really, I guess, to the panelists, where would you see it being important for organizations to spend the most time, or where do you see some of the budget that goes into these different steps?
I could take that. I see probably 80% of this, at least from my side of it, reactionary. There's very little budget, or I think of the overall pie, I see less being done on the proactivity. It does happen, but usually it comes off of some event, either internally to their company or a front page Wall Street Journal article that makes them wonder whether they should do something. And so at least in my seat, it does break up that way. It's harder for companies to be proactive when there isn't much that they've had before. They say, well, we haven't gotten breached yet, so why would we put a large budget in front of this? And so I think from my point, that's what I see. I don't know, what about you, from yours?
I think it depends on the industry.
Yeah.
So I think in financial, nowadays healthcare is better, right? And what happened, Anthem.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, there's normally a big boom for people to realize they need to do that. More immature postures normally start with the boom, and a response strategy starts to get elucidated. You bring someone in to help you, you learn from that, you develop a process, and you learn to keep that. You get a little bit better by recognizing that detection needs to get better, and you start putting in the right devices. High five on that one. And then you get to the point where you have everything in place to work on preparation. I think the mistake people make is whenever they try to go directly to preparation and prevention and preventative analytics and so on, if you don't have the right detection in place and the right response, you're not ready for that. So it's a maturity pool.
Yeah, and we had one client who came to us and says, we want to do a tabletop exercise. Red team, blue team, let's do this. Let's fight. And I'm like, you don't want to do that. And they're like, why not? We want to do it. And I'm like, because you're going to get destroyed. Like you don't even know what your weaknesses are. How do you even prepare your team to be able to handle that sort of thing? And they're like, well, how do you know we're going to fail? I'm like, well, because we've done a very high level assessment of what you have in place, and we're not even sure that you can respond adequately before they'd be in your network. So I think there's some of that.
And would you know? I think there was some, I don't know if we have those stats here, but most breaches these days can sit for months before they're even detected. And oftentimes they're not detected by the organization themselves. I think more often than not, it's third parties or customers.
Yeah, in the last 2 days, 2 companies that are in the security world have come out with breach notices. NordVPN and Avast Antivirus, just in the last few days.
That's pretty embarrassing.
And they're ones who are in this world, so.
Created a VP. You had questions? We already doing.
So, yeah, well, Chris Ricks from California, I'll start with. So how do you see CCPA affecting preparation going forward? And then the rest of it, because you're also going to have to deal with this issue also.
Man, we got CCPA in with under 5 minutes.
That didn't take long.
That's a record. Honestly, I don't see the two.
We should just repeat the question. I don't know if you guys can hear him in the back. He said, how is CCPA impacting or affecting preparation going forward now that it's becoming such a hot topic?
More data privacy in general, as the dawn of privacy in America becomes an issue, do you see that changing the paradigm of preparation and really proactive preparedness?
Sure. I mean, does everyone know what the CCPA is all? I mean, that's been tossed around quite a bit. Anyone not know? But just embarrass yourselves. That's not going to happen. If you're not here, raise your hand. I'll punt that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I'll start with a high level first and just mention, I think that there's a larger issue that people aren't recognizing with this. We no longer have a 9-to-5 work life. So expecting privacy outside of those hours is very weird. You want the person to work off their mobile device, working from a VPN, working from home. They have reasonable expectation of privacy. That has to have a different relationship now.
well,
It's not
man,
a 9-to-5
how would you
world.
define the difference between,
A reasonable expectation of privacy?
well, privacy and security? I mean, what's the
Yeah.
difference?
So you can't have privacy without security. but you can have the other way around. So I think I don't see the two being aligned yet with companies. And if you look at, what companies are hiring, privacy counsel. You don't see cybersecurity counsel, very rarely. And so but then some kind of mix it together and they think, well, privacy is also security. And so you have these kind of weird issues of crossover, but I don't so far see companies saying, oh, CCPA, we need to get our security house in order. They're more concerned about like data classification, how do we find data we have when we have it, these systems were never built in order, to query them at large scale and put them into a nice package to hand over to someone who's requesting their data.
Yeah,
So
the amount of calls we're starting to all of a sudden get about pseudo-anonymization of data and
yeah.
cleaning it with all marketing companies, that are selling third-party
Or
data.
the marketing department that has, shadow IT behind the scenes because somebody in sales decided that it would be a great idea to buy a marketing database and not tell anybody in IT. And gosh, I wonder where all the PII is,
Yeah.
So in this too, again, we want to emphasize that, again, there's a process, and really what you want to do is get to your mean time to respond, mean time to recover. The process is supposed to be in place so you can get through these steps really easily, or as easy as possible. Easy is an easy word to use in a hard situation, but you want to minimize that downtime and business interruption and get services back up and reduce costs. It's risk mitigation for the management. That comes down to another question I have when we were talking about, these surveys and saying, are you ready for this? Do we think it's reasonable to expect that you should have an IR plan for most small to medium-sized organizations? Are they still kind of abdicating a little bit of that?
I think that's like step one. Like, how do you not have an IR plan? But go ahead.
I agree. It's got to be step one. If you don't have like a who to call list, like who's your red phone, who are the people that have to be at the table to make decisions within the first critical few hours, that's the worst time to be scrambling through your phone list of like, I can't find this guy's number, where's it at? And this happens more than you think. So one of the things we always evangelize is at least put something in writing, even if it's like a 2-pager, laminate it, put it, whoever needs to be at the table should be able to be in contact quickly. And so I think that's pretty basic. I think medium-sized companies are obviously much more likely because they have more resources to do it. Small companies, of the ones I know of that we service, I don't see it very much. But some of them have a very small risk profile and are like, there's only 12 of us, so we can get the right people together. So, it just depends on what you're...
I think it comes back to industry, though, because most of
definitely
my
does.
work these days is largely driven by insurance, and I think there's something to be said for that about what they're doing to impact the industry.
Oh, yeah.
But it's usually the dentist's office, right, that has all of their patient records that are, in someone's inbox, or a CPA firm of 8 people, and now you've got thousands and thousands of tax records with everyone's social security number on there. So I think
solo
those
practitioner lawyers, not to pick on that, but we should.
or municipalities. Like we've worked on projects where it's like the DA's office gets popped, and the treasure trove of information that they're sitting on, and the point being that they don't really have a process. There is zero. Right? They haven't even started at zero yet. There's no IR process in place. It's scramble, let's hope I have a cyber insurance policy.
Recognizing that the IR process may be that we call this firm and we have them on retainer and they help us when we have an incident. That's a perfectly acceptable resolution for an IR plan in the beginning.
That's right.
I have no qualms with that being their step one, so that's perfectly okay. But you do have to acknowledge that it's inevitable, so be ready.
Yeah, and part of it, with the slide that I have up, has anybody heard or seen the cyber kill chain steps before? Again, lobbing softballs up, but the idea is that this is how an attack happens, essentially. Organizations are usually getting reconned, meaning there's somebody out there figuring out how to get in to the point where they start delivering their weaponized malware or other types of attacks that get in and continue to get in, move laterally, and what we see a lot is organizations that do have incidents where we did talk a little bit about that dwell time of being hundreds of days, meaning somebody's in that organization's network for months before anybody figures it out, is because they're doing what we call living off the land. Once they get in, they move around really quietly. They maintain a low profile, keep their presence. They don't want to get caught, so they're just doing things until somebody might detect them. Maybe a tool's in place. Or, what I've seen a number of times, the second or third attack group that's on the network are the sloppy ones that become a little bit noisy.
And they give
and
up
alert.
the first ones.
Oh yeah, I've had one where the poor ransomware guy, or not ransomware guy, the Bitcoin miner guy was in there working quietly, had all his tools working quietly in the background, then somebody went in through an open RDP port, made that noisy. Then I had two attackers fighting on a box while I'm trying to kick both of them out. And it was, stepping on each other's toes. But the idea is that, you want to stop this stuff as quickly as possible. There's things that you can and can't do at each stage too. It's actually really hard to stop reconnaissance. I mean, we have to market ourselves. We have to get things out there about ourselves. So going to sites like LinkedIn, your websites, pulling down that information, you want it there for your customers, but that's what attackers are using as well. So it's important to kind of know what's out there about you and how that can be used. Because one of the big
point
things,
on that one for reconnaissance, I don't know if anyone's used the site showdan.net, but that's a great one if you want to go to your own organization and type in and see what's out there and just at least get an idea about one of the tools that attackers can use to do part of the technical reconnaissance. It's a very interesting site.
You got a
Like
live
if you
internet
type in like
connection?
links as router and get
no, if I started doing showdown stuff, like people, will see the color drain from their face because it's bad what's out there and how easy it
Yeah.
is to find out information.
Yeah, you'll see like test servers that were never taken down that just are there. So I would say if you want to have some fun, go check that out.
We do
It's
not
pretty interesting.
advocate popping any of those boxes you discover with open ports, please.
But keep in mind that this originated from the military for radio signal waves. So the intent is that if you break one link in this chain, you will no longer be successful in your exploit. And that's a great point about defense in depth. But you're not going to break a lot of reconnaissance per chance, but weaponization, delivery, et cetera, break one link in this chain and you have a pretty strong capability of recovering.
Yep.
So looking at that, and as we kind of looked at the IR process, again, more on maybe the tactical aspects of this, where are good places to make that investment to be prepared for these types of events?
I mean, I think it's always in the preventative, obviously. So that means that, so like reconnaissance, let's make this something that you all have probably dealt with on a daily basis. You get an email, it's a phishing email, there's nothing in it, it's a blank email. But the point of that email was not for you to respond, and it wasn't for you to click on something, it was just to see if your email address works and resolves. Because the real attack will come later. That's reconnaissance, right? So putting in the right tools, I'm sure you're going to have a slide for this, the right tools,
Oh, I know. I went through
technology,
that
people, process.
I figured we'd talk about it.
Yeah, but so putting in, it always comes down to this and making sure that you have, at least the very beginning, a tool. So like whatever you're going to block with, proof point, et cetera, some kind of a mechanism that says we're going to block this major vector that's coming in. A lot of things that we can determine are bad or malicious. That's the big one. The tactics, the procedures have to be in place. And then the last one, your last line of defense, the people. But I would put it in the preventative and a reconnaissance and weaponization.
Well, as a purchaser of security products, I'm sure you get pitched constantly, Amanda, on the different things that are out there. How do you make the choice of what you're going to implement in your program? What some of the processes you go through in vetting, I should say?
We're pretty hardcore about the vetting of a tool before we commit to it. We consider each vendor a partnership. There's a lot of vetting. High five. That's my man. We do a lot of POCs that go through and we actually weigh, and we have really clear success requirements in the beginning about what we're intending to get from this and how it's going to help us. So we actually prescribe to the kill chain, but we also prescribe to attack and pre-attack. So we determine where is this going to help us, and we disperse it and say, okay, this is going to get us 80% of what we're looking for here, and so on. So success requirements are clear from the beginning. We POC them. Normally, we like to try 3 different type of vendors for anything we're going to do. So we normally do like one of the old school people that's been in the industry for a long time in this space, a startup. We have a little bit of a soft spot for startups, and then somebody who's kind of like a midway. So we like to POC all 3 and see which one is doing the most for our success.
And part of that, how often or where does legal get involved? Your legal department talking about cybersecurity purchases, or do they at all?
So our legal department actually goes in with our CFO, who I'm a little close with, right? It's got to be the person who's going to be helping me determine what we procure, what we're going to do here. But legal gets involved at the point after we've made a decision. We go to them and discuss with them what we think we're going to get out of it and so on, and if there's any concerns on their side. But privacy actually sits with me. So if that's where you're going with it, it's me. I determine.
I was
Yeah,
going down that
privacy.
path pretty obviously, but
Compliance reports to me, privacy reports to me, so that's all under me.
Okay. And from the practicing lawyer perspective, how often do you get calls from CISOs or CIOs that say, hey, look, we're concerned about the purchases we're making, because not just from the contractual things, I don't care about the MSAs, but how is it going to get involved with the data privacy aspect?
I mean, we definitely get calls about like how to deal with data categorization and like finding PII. I think that's mainly what we get questions about. It's not necessarily, the questions don't usually start with, we're buying this product, is it adequate? It's what product should we look at?
Okay.
Because we don't know what's out there, and what are your other clients doing? And so we're kind of in the position of saying, well, here's, depending on what,
Vertical.
what kind of data you're collecting and how big you are, I guess there's a right size product for you, and, depending on budget and all that. So we kind of go through that analysis and say, hey, here's the ones I would look at. Here, if you want endpoint interrogation for PII, do this. If you want to do structured data, do this. And so there's a few different ways we go about it, but I think that's generally how it starts, is like, hey, we recognize we have to, where do we go now?
And Chris, with you, I mean, with some of the stuff we work on, it always becomes, look, we're dealing with sensitive data. And when you're looking to productize some of the things from the server side, where does security sit in that planning and process?
I make sure I have people like you around to vet that out. No, we have a pretty big team. There's a number of different products that we're using. Again, it's the world that we're in is someone's had a breach and now they're handing off their sensitive data to us, and could be the source of a new breach. Oftentimes, a big chunk of the work that we do is categorizing and mining for that PII after the breach has happened. So a lot of the damage has been done, but we're also doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the attackers, in that once we categorize it, we're taking all this unstructured data, going through finding the PII, and then we're putting it into a nice clean little report so that it can be used for notification purposes. But if you just get that one report from us, that's all you need. Now you didn't even need the hack anymore. You just needed us to step in and do all the work for you. So there's a fair amount of scrutiny. Like most of my work is on the sales side, and there are things that my project team won't even, like, I can't even access some of the files that they're sending back and forth to breach counsel, right? They're triple encrypted on some server somewhere that you have to get access to through some sort of two-factor.
Blood samples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, guys, can I see that report? And I haven't seen one since the day I started, because there's just no reason for that to end up in my inbox. So it's situations like that. I mean, we're obviously, again, way down the path in terms of what's happened. Like, obviously something went wrong, and we're there cleaning up the mess, but we need to be super cognizant and extra careful, because we can create a huge mess, and all it takes is one of those slip-ups to happen, and we'll probably never be providing cyber services again after that happens. So it's pretty scary.
I mean, I just knowing from our experience where we had to build a lot of security around our relativity databases that are holding this, it's toxic data. I mean, you don't want to have it, but it's the reality that it exists. And then I think we've seen it where we've had to then walk the client through. You get breach counsel, like, great, can you send me that report? And I need the social security numbers with it. I'm like, no, why do you need, stop creating more problems? But it's re-educating people, and how often what you're seeing going through the IR process is taking that lessons learned so you don't have repeat offenders. Have you all had experiences, at least with people saying, wow, that sucked, how do we prevent that from happening again?
Yes, and then it happens again because they don't follow the directions.
I like
that we
the
go.
fifth,
I mean, it does
email
happen.
compromise I have this week with the same client, but yeah.
It happens. I mean, it unfortunately happens. Like, you'll have an event and you go in and say, look, we dealt with the one event, but here's the recommendations to try to prevent things. And then it just doesn't happen. Or they do part of it and don't follow through. And, it's unfortunate. And then you get another call, hey, we have another situation. And, you don't want to say I told you so, because that's not really good, as a partner, but
Not a good sales strategy.
But in some ways, it's like, I get that they're, in some organizations, it's trying to sell this as a struggle, especially, manufacturing, for example. They're like, we just make stuff, like, who cares? I'm like, China cares. They're going to care a lot, and they're going to go and produce it for a quarter of the price, and you're going to care then. And so you have to kind of get real with them and say, listen, in a situation like this, you guys should probably operate in a presumed breach state at all times, given how you don't really have any controls. So I'm sure you've seen repeat issues too, and you guys.
That's how I keep my job for the next couple of years.
Look, people have a short memory. When a
Yeah.
breach happens, you have about 5 to 15 business days to get increase in budget and changes to occur. But the unfortunate part is that an incident response takes a couple weeks to get all that information. So by the time your report is done, people are already kind of forgetful that this has happened. It's just the unfortunate part of it.
Yeah.
But I think that that's where it comes in, that you have to get buy-in from leadership as early on in your program as you can, because that's how you affect real change.
Yeah, and that goes to some of the things we discussed as we prep for this panel. What are some of the aspects of a successful security program that you like to see? One, in how it's structured, but also how you communicate that to management.
I mean, we had a lot to say about this one on the call. You
Yeah.
guys want to start?
I guess I can. I think you have to have some sort of a role like Amanda's role that can actually have a conversation with the CEO and regular check-ins to say, how are we doing, what's going on, providing any sort of statistics about here's what we've detected, stopped, prevented, et cetera. Here's some notable things that happened, or things that you're doing proactively. I think it's probably the biggest part, at least from my purview.
I think that's a good point, actually, to hit on tracking. And this might be a little bit like information that's not really pertinent to everybody, but every single week I have to report on a vital to the executive team in a meeting, and I have to answer 3 questions. Is our product secure? And I have to give data behind this, and we actually have a whole bunch of dashboards and so on that talks about vulnerabilities and so on. There's a lot of data behind it.
Management loves pie charts.
No, we use Tableau, we got some
Okay.
of those,
Oh,
so we do, is our product secure? Are we in compliance of our program, with compliance with all of our controls and so on? And the third one, and I hate this one, are we safe from cyber threats? No, we're not. I mean, why would we? So you have to look for ways to measure as much as you can. So I've tried so many different mechanisms with like the cybersecurity framework, or you try to bring in third parties to show this is the needle and how you've gotten better. And we've done spider charts and all of that. And at the end of the day, it came down to they just decided to trust me. Sounds like she knows what she's talking about, and they let it go. And that's great. We still track the other 2, but the cyber one is so difficult to track. How do you say you're safe from cyber? You're not.
well, and then it comes down to what I think we discussed too, what the whole reason we have a panel set up, but this is a team effort, really. You really have to get the right people also carrying your message, so legal feels that IT is doing the right job and there's not this conflict. Has that, and again, I'm going to ask loaded questions because that's what I'm here for. Has it always been an easy challenge to overcome, or has it gotten better now that more people are, let's say, cyber aware organizationally?
So I'll move away from relativity. It's not fair, right? That one's,
Sure.
I'm so close with the CIO and IT and so on. So
And
it
your
doesn't-
security's perfect, didn't we just walk through it? So.
Nobody's perfect, Sweet,
Safe
but-
from cyber threat, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but I'll say in the past, let's say that there are companies that I've worked on, and I think that the real shift and difficulty that you've had between the organizations with legal, IT, security, and so on, is that there's like you said in the beginning, a lack of a common language, a lack of understanding the risk associated with something that's occurring. Because legal may be trying to do something or accomplish something or move some data, and there might be a low risk, but security's locking it down and not letting them get it done. And it's slowing everything down, or the vice versa. Legal's moving something and they don't understand the risk associated with it. So I think that that's where I've seen the most friction occur, is that these 2 entities don't necessarily speak the same language all the time. But when they truly do, and not to be hippie-ish, but when they truly dialogue and understand the risk together, I think it's a better situation.
Yeah, it's a sexy world of risk management.
It's so exciting.
Yeah, and I think there's also, at a higher level, I think, legal's looking at what's the liability legally. Are we going to have litigation? Are we going to have regulatory problems if we do something? Whereas, someone else might say, what's the business risk to, if we see our name on the front page or something, it's going to be a bad PR nightmare. So that's a different risk for them, and it's all risk for the business, but for each pillar of the company, they look at it differently, so.
Yeah.
And I'd say, well, a lot of in-house counsel, if we're talking about the difference between understanding, it really is that language. Even in-house counsel, we're finding, I think I was asking you at the beginning if you have any situations where you have in-house GCs trying to step in and manage the risk piece or the liability piece after the fact, after an attack happens or there's an incident. I think there's a big misnomer that I'm a lawyer, I can understand what happens, and it's actually a very, very specialized sub-niche of, the legal
That
landscape.
goes both ways. I see a lot of security people who think they can understand legal documents, and you don't. Like, we should be cautious. You're a subject matter expert for a reason.
For a reason, yeah. So so what I alluded to earlier is that we do a lot of work on the insurance side, and what we're seeing is that it is forcing, obviously they have panels, providers, and firms typically that, their job is to reduce the cost, but they're also in there trying to reduce the risk. For every claim that they don't pay out, the better their company does. So we're starting to see some pretty interesting, innovative stuff, at least in the cyber world. It's been from what on the IR side, I feel like largely the Wild West in comparison to some of the, if you come from an e-discovery world 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when, we had servers in a broom closet, with actually a mop and a broom next to it and a
It was
bucket
very
of water
cold,
there.
I
It was
remember.
very cold, yeah. And it was the Wild West. We're starting to see a little bit of sort of agreement amongst, and I think insurance is going to drive a lot of this because they're selling all these cyber risk policies. I don't think a lot of them in the early goings knew exactly what they were selling. But we are seeing them band together and start putting together some of these, they come up with, it's the insurance industry, they come up with names for this stuff like betterment or preventative care. I mean, I think there's a couple of joint insurance funds that we're working with that are giving incentives to the insured to get like a cyber hygiene, like health check
Yeah,
on a yearly
essentially, if you
basis.
stop smoking, we'll reduce your premium.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
they
reduce
do
your
those, like,
premium. Yeah.
self-assessment surveys online. Have you seen those?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Those are interesting. I've seen those a few times.
that's not fair. We're competing with those.
I'm building one of those.
Yeah.
And they're like, nope, I'm good, see?
No, but then there comes the validation. I mean, yeah, when everybody, again, if you're getting a life insurance policy, you fill out the questionnaire, but you still have to get a health check.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's jump a little bit into the survey now. So the survey again was conducted, so I'll read the stats, 150 lawyers inside corporations, 100 paralegals, corporate, and 250 IT decision makers at organizations with 500 plus employees. So it's a pretty good cross-section. And there was 30 different questions on their general preparedness and how well people feel that they think their organization can, be preventative, detect, respond, recover from cyber incidents. So we did the survey this past summer, and again, everything was kind of from an unsure rated up to extremely prepared. And I'm not going to read from the slide certainly, but I'll kind of throw these up as talking points because there are some interesting takeaways that at least we had from this. And one of the questions that we had was overall, how prepared is your organization to deal with a data breach? So 87% of IT respondents said extremely or very prepared versus more conservatively the legal saying 55%. Where we also have 20% of legal respondents said not prepared at all compared to 0% of IT. So right there, even on the numbers, we're starting to see the disconnect between legal and IT.
We're already laughing because we only get the call when they weren't prepared for the most
Did you
part.
guys attempt to breach any of those places?
No comment.
We said we were certified ethical hackers.
Ethical. White hats.
Yeah. So I mean, are you guys surprised by those numbers that there's this disparity that IT is like, yeah, absolutely, we got this.
I think that the first thing you're seeing here is that IT has much more visibility into what's being done for the process and the tools that are in place and so on, and if the tools are configured correctly and so on. And legal may not have a daily interaction with that. So I think the first thing you're seeing is a disparity there because they have more knowledge about the specifics. But I think that there's also something you have to take away here. 86.9%, 99%, it only takes one. So it doesn't really matter how prepared you think. It just takes one click and one person. So that's what I feel about it.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I don't really have much to add to it, other than I think in some cases IT might have a false sense of security. I don't want to use that word, but you know what I'm saying, that I think they believe that things are locked down, and maybe in some instances I've seen that they really feel that's true. And then they're proven otherwise, and then it becomes personal for them because it's kind of like this was their house,
IKEA
right?
syndrome.
And so they, I think they're proud that they're doing something and they think it's good, and I think that's the right direction. But, I think sometimes legal may not realize necessarily that it's deeply personal sometimes for these folks when they're in that, because they're under the microscope too. Because everyone's going to be asking, well, how'd that happen? Why'd you let it happen?
There's very little kudos for when their job, when they're doing everything right,
Yeah, it's
it means
selfless, yeah.
nothing's not broke. I mean, nothing's broken.
Right.
So it's kind of a thankless position.
Yep.
I looked at these numbers and I'm like, who did we ask these questions to?
I just told you.
I know. Well, more so from like, it was, we definitely see in the larger organizations, the IT groups or the teams, they'll have like a dedicated security InfoSec team. So I think they could, be a bit more confident. And again, unless you've had an attack and it's gone the full distance of like a PR, nightmare, or if it's found its way to the news, I don't know if I'd be interested to dig deeper into I'm a geek, so I try to like dig into these numbers a little bit to find out who we're talking to and what sort of the perspective they're coming from. But I feel like the larger organizations we've seen have actually been pretty well prepared. We've had some like actual smooth responses, or responding to an incident with IT teams from the larger organizations, those small, mid-sized ones that are sort of throwing their
Yeah, I mean,
hands
there are
up.
exceptions. I mean, I've come across at least a couple publicly traded companies that had no CISO, no CIO, and just basically they said IT, you're responsible for all of it. And so they didn't really have like that role that oversaw the security only. It was make everything work, right? And then the security
screw
part
up.
was kind of like part of that, instead of having like an accountable like C-suite person to actually like drive, the frameworks, actually like doing self-testing, evaluation, setting up like maturity models, and then building a plan to get there. So it does happen that you can still be publicly traded and not have a CISO.
Well, I think we see, is it cybersecurity, IT security? Is it an IT problem? What problem does cyber preparedness come under? Like whose
I
house?
think that depends on the maturity. So prior to me, it was in IT. Security was in IT. We are a completely different team at this point and completely separate, and I report directly to the CEO. So at some point, your maturity shifts. But you bring up a good point I was going to say before we move on. There are three things I think everyone should always look for whenever you're looking at a product or a vendor or anything. The first one is there a person dedicated to this role? You're absolutely right. I think that's important, somebody who's responsible and dedicated, that is not just like, Sheila in IT or Sheila and, over here really likes security. It's not about that. It's more than that. The second one is, do they have some type of controls in place, normally some type of a certification, not because compliance is security, but because it means you're testing to make sure you do the right thing every time, and you collect that evidence to prove that. And then the third thing is there a culture of security that's being worked on or is already in place. Those things have to be present whenever you want to partner with somebody, when you look at a vendor, et cetera, and I think that they're not always present regardless of the location.
We've seen, just from a service provider perspective, because we do get looked at with way more scrutiny these days than we ever have. And it's largely being driven by those larger organizations that are going to send us their information or their data. And I'm usually the worst culprit, the one who hasn't taken his security and awareness training in Q3, and I'm getting yelled at by the compliance people. But it has become to the forefront, obviously back in the days of the broom closet servers to today, where it's like, look, our entire business, our certifications, our SOC 2, our ISO, all of that hinges on a lot of us being aware of what it is that we're working with, and knowing that if we don't have this level of awareness, we could lose our business, because now it's so much of what we're doing in evidence management, whether it's e-discovery, breach response, when we're basically in the trust game. We're asking someone else to trust us with what could be their evidence. So it is becoming a big part of, like you said, culture, right? It's not so much a culture of fear, but it's just understanding that this is fully intertwined with how our business stays in business.
I think it's a culture of responsibility. I think it's more important to focus on the fact that this is a noble industry. We're doing amazing things, and you should take accountability. This is going to be really cheesy, but it's my favorite thing from like one of the Spider-Man movies. If you're nothing without the suit, you don't deserve to have it. It's the same thing. If you have all this power, comes great responsibility. Like, these are all the things that we should be thinking with this industry. It's really important.
Well,
We squeeze in a Lion King quote?
I will.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so culture's great, we could have a love fest about that, but one of the things I see stopped out occasionally is, okay, but who's gonna pay for it? What budget does this come out of? And that goes back to accountability and the responsibility side, but how do you make it a shared cost across the organization?
I'm probably the worst person to look at for budget questions.
You just get a free check,
We have a lot of commitment, I think, but I think the reason why we focus on the culture is because it costs nothing a lot of times, not security awareness. Sure, putting a program in can cost something, but affecting a change doesn't have to be something that costs money. And I think that's important to focus there. There's a lot of open source things that you could be doing as well. There's a lot of just manual labor that you could put into it. But when it comes down to it, where the budget comes from, I think, is where it always falls apart. And everybody starts to battle about, well, who's going to pay for this and who's going to pay for that. I think it depends on how much you want to prioritize it, right? Every annual, you have to say, these are the key imperatives we're going to focus on in this group. And at some point, security awareness becomes part of that.
Okay. I'm going to pop over to detection now. So we have an awesome IT structure and all these people together. Proverbial crap hits the fan now, though. Now we actually have to detect and respond. And so some of the numbers on that were pretty interesting. Because, again, we've talked about that average dwell time of being months before it's even detected. So there's different things. We're not going to get too granular about alerting, detection, what we're going to declare an incident versus a breach. They are very different things that get used a little too interchangeably, and there's nuances because not every alert's an event, and once you correlate them, they might not all be an incident. And I think that's one of the things that we try to get clients to do is not send that email saying, oh my God, we think we just had a data breach. Is outside counsel on this? No. Okay, that's a great start. So
He's already sweating.
Usually I get forwarded that email.
yeah. Yeah. So overall, though, they say, how prepared is your
Thanks.
organization to deal with a
Thanks,
data
Scott.
breach? 87% of IT respondents said extremely or very prepared versus 55%. Oh, no, it was the other one. I'm sorry. Overall, how long do you estimate it would take for your organization to detect and respond to a data breach? Similar kind of numbers. 86 of IT said 0 to 3 days compared to 21% of legal respondents in that period. And 56% of legal said it would take longer than a business week. So it's an interesting question because I think there's a disconnect there just on the IT side of going through that IR process of actually detecting and responding and getting containment versus maybe even having to notify a regulator. So again, what do you guys think of the numbers on this one?
I mean, it's real, from my point of view, it's largely dependent on what kind of breach it is. I mean, I've had breaches that were like 3-4 days because they detected it, we had logs, we were able to shut it down, and the data they got didn't have any PII or any finance or trade secrets. Okay, fix the hole and move on. And then there's others that last months and months because you have to go through, what these guys do and, figure out where the PI is. Even with like AI technologies, you still have to QC and make sure you don't miss it. You still have to prepare notices. You have to determine whether you're over the threshold for, records that were leaked that require reporting to the attorney generals of whatever states you operate in or countries. And so it becomes, and then you have GDPR issues, but I'm not even going to touch that right now. That
how
could
we
be a
got
session
GDPR in this
on
one,
itself.
too.
So, it just really depends on the type of breach you're dealing with.
Have you worked on a GDPR?
Oh my God, yes. The ones with like,
Protected-
We just got to say New York State
43
DFS, we've
countries.
covered all of them at this point.
Yeah, it's, those
Yeah,
those
because
take some
mining
time.
for information, so at least in the States, there's, for the most part, clearly defined definitions of what constitutes protected information, or public, PII, whereas in Europe, we worked on a few of these where we had data that we had to mine through, and anything that was protected information needed to be flagged and identified for notification purposes.
Yeah, and
Basically,
Yeah, let's say, but you also only see all breach review stuff. So there's a lot of things you don't ever see because it was just an incident. And maybe
Right.
there was a determination from forensics that no data went out.
Yep.
At what point in the legal process do you start stepping and say, okay, where do we get a temperature on this? Do I have to kind of warm up the AGs a little bit and do a little back rubbing to them?
There is that point.
Yeah.
but
I mean,
some of this was like
it's-
time to respond. So like
Yeah.
you get the call, you're pretty early on, once the incident happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's
That
worse
was-
with GDPR because you have such a quick
Yeah, I didn't-
turnaround. I mean, if you think you have EU data, you got to move fast, and you generally have to get more resources to try to assess that and determine, do we have an obligation within these, these first critical few days or not, to make a move.
It's like 3 days, right?
Yeah, 72 hours, right?
Noted, yeah. But like you'll get the call and you've got to manage forensics, investigation. I mean, there's all sorts of steps that happen. So I think some of the IT folks are responding to the survey saying they can do something in 0 to 5 days. Obviously, I'm farther down the
Yeah.
food chain in terms of, when we step in on the service provider side to do certain things. But usually we're getting, so I'll take HIPAA, for example, right? If there's health information or patient data that's in question, there's some pretty tight deadlines, and it's usually 60 days, to get those notifications out. And oftentimes I don't get the call from breach counsel or the client until there's like 9 days left. So,
Yeah, I mean,
what do you
that's
guys do
Just
for
like
those
you
first
described it.
51
Well,
days?
I think that's a good point. Is the IT thinks of this as, oh, I can go through it and figure this out. And it's like determining a breach versus an incident is a careful needle to thread.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, IT's job is also over before the lawyers.
Yep.
Because they're like, we provide the logs, we've helped out with some of the consultants, and then it can trail off, and then it's handed off to, deal with all the legal parts. I think there's probably some of that reflected in these.
Well, as we looked at the process before, how often have you got into this, somebody's clients called you, said, we've had this event, blah, 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 and you're like, great, let's get forensics involved, or something, they're like, oh, no, we already rebuilt all the servers.
Yeah, that's happened.
More than once?
Or we detected it, do you have logs? Yes. Do they go back to the event? No. It overwrites after 3 days. And you're like, well,
Well,
okay.
we need to get
And then you
services
got to
back
figure
up,
other stuff
whatever it
out.
is,
I mean, I don't know what, I mean, you've probably seen some interesting stories too.
Yeah,
From like
as in,
what,
I've normally
how those
not
go.
walked into a war room that didn't have like 50 people who shouldn't be in there, including a lot of lawyers at the time are not needed for that part. So what ends up happening is that the war rooms get split. There ends up being a technical war room, and there ends up being the war room with
Yeah.
everybody who's dealing with the policies and so on that are in there. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's pretty clearly defined what an incident is. I don't think everybody understands the definition. So like typically we align with like NIST 861 categorizations of what type of an incident and so on. And I don't think that everybody understands it. I think a lot of people would read the survey question and say breach means anything, and
Yes.
they automatically, yep, that's a breach. I got an email, it was bad. You know, that's not a breach. There was no expectation. There was no post anything. There was nothing. So I think that the definition, it always goes back to that common language. There's an issue there. But I don't know.
I think that, and that's also something that I evangelize against when clients call me and they say, we have a breach. And I'm like, no, you don't. You have a security incident until we prove you have a breach.
I say an event.
Yeah, event is also good because sometimes that data breach phrase has some liabilities behind it immediately. And so, to your point, the email that scared me was the one, we have a data breach, counsel's not on it, and then I get it because they've already classified it that way, and so now I have to try to unclassify it.
But it's still in the subject line, no
Let's
matter
step
what.
back. Yeah,
And if they're in your
So,
network
I
and they
think
see
there's
that email,
501 people in Illinois. Why are you putting this in the?
I mean, I remember early going, when I started, I evolved from e-discovery into cyber, and I got my hand slapped pretty hard by breach counsel. They're like, Chris, stop putting the word breach in the sub. I'm like, these are
Well, one of the
DV.
things we did, again, we took Relativity, built out all these dashboards and cool things we can show, hotspots of the number of individuals per state.
Oh, that
Breach
backfired.
Counsel was like, take that down immediately. Now that I know, I have to do
Yeah,
something different.
this
As a
was,
tech, we thought it was awesome.
yeah, we were really embarrassed. So we're like, look, we're going doing some sort of sales pitch, and we put up this heat map of the United States that shows the number of affected individuals that were identified in a data set that was allegedly exfiltrated. I'm careful with my words now. And they're like, what is this? I'm like, this is the new report we're going to roll out to you guys. We could send this to you every single night. They're like, is this dummy data? What are we looking at? I'm like, no, this is a live snapshot into the project we're working on for you right now. They're like, take it down right now. Because it was like, if there's certain things that start a clock.
Yes.
For the lawyers, ethically, I guess you have to step in and be like, all right, I know there's X amount of impacted individuals in Florida, and I think we were like right at 499. He's like, please take that down.
yeah, and if it's dynamic and changing, then, if it's coming out, so I can see why they would do that. And I think a lot of times what we do as counsel is try to get through the assessment. So let's see what we
Right.
have, look at it, and once we can confirm there's actually an issue, then you have to move quickly to identify who is affected and do all the notices. But you don't want it piecemeal. You don't want to be like, Massachusetts, okay, and then tomorrow, New Jersey just went over the top. And so, because you get like kind of torn in a lot of different directions, so it's not as efficient. So I think that's probably where part
No,
of
we
my-
know now. I mean, we keep our mouths
Well,
shut
it's
until
to
we
the
have all
point-
the information.
To the point that I highlighted on the slide, though, is, I mean, this is what IT thinks that they're good. A vast majority of them think that they're protected from a data breach from a legal perspective. That, to me, is the reason I highlight. It's a big takeaway that there's still this disconnect from what the legal obligations might be from the IT provider's perspective internally. Number speaks for itself.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a tough one.
that one's hard. I think the plaintiff's bar would prove otherwise, and that, I think look, we don't see that many breach litigations unless it's over a certain threshold. And I think it's because plaintiff's bar realizes that it's not going to pay off unless there's enough records. So you have, 10,000 records at a dentist's office, probably not going to get sued. Probably not. You could, but probably not.
Until things like CCPA come up with,
Yeah.
let's open that floodgate.
Statutory.
Which is going to bring up an interesting point, which is, we have to talk about CCPA, I mean, it's the elephant in the room. But, there's a aspect of it says you have to have reasonable security standards in place. If not, the, private right of action may or may not get in. But if I can sue people for not having reasonable security standards in the state of California, and there's mandatory fines.
Yeah, it's going to change things in that realm, I think, because now there's another thing to hold their hook on instead of just like negligence or, some other theory of liability that plaintiff's bars usually have hooked onto. So it's just going to give them another cause of action that actually might have more teeth.
Yep.
And we're starting to already see some of these cases get filed, or at least actions get filed. Sort of, we believe, just in sort of watching from an armchair, that they're prepping, knowing that as soon as these laws drop on January 1, the other shoe's going to drop. I think something as simple as the weather app, one of these weather apps where it was tracking someone's geodata, and then plaintiff's firm came out and said, you've got all this.
Point of it?
Chris,
Yeah, it
talk
was,
about that.
it was a GPS data attached to a weather app, and
I
it's
want to know where
like,
the weathers are
yeah,
going.
Yeah, but it's an easy thing to throw it against the wall, say, hey,
See
be
what
a judge and let
happens.
it stick.
Exactly.
Which kind of, goes back into a little bit with the first point here, but, again, about the regulatory requirements, that it still seems to be this education that needs to happen internally with a lot of folks of what regulation is, compliance, privacy, security. And again, it comes down to common language. As providers in the space, and as somebody that has to be pitched to by providers, how do we make that better? What do we need to do as security people sitting on a stage to fix the language problem?
more salespeople.
I don't know if that was what I was getting at with this.
That's never the answer to anything. I just wanted to throw it out
I
there,
kind
see
of-
if that one.
I-
But to the point is, we make a lot of buzzwords, and then people get desensitized to things. We throw around data breach a lot, and we
Yes.
use a lot of words in
Yes.
selling services
World
that creates a
peace.
problem.
It's a common one.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense to have, to your point of having too many people in the room that aren't necessary, I think the flip side of that is trying to have a liaison from the IT or security group and legal who meet regularly and try to learn what each other's world is about. Even if it's half an hour a month, just to say, hey, here's what we're doing, here's what we're doing, explain it to each other and try to establish a line of communication so that when you actually have an issue, there's at least two people who have enough rapport to come together and say, oh, this is that thing you were talking about 2 months ago, yeah, that's it. So I don't know, have you seen that work? Have you seen anyone doing it?
We do something different. We have in the entire company, not just with those groups, we have security champions. So embedded in every team across Relativity, there are security champions that have gone through special training with security. So whenever somebody wants to put together a new project, they can look at it and say, oh, that looks like we may want to talk to security about it.
dicey.
And we have people embedded in there. So from within, we started a security advocacy group. It was essentially all the people, we have a really active employee base. They're very vocal. And so we started this group of all the people who are most vocal against security decisions. We're like, man, they really attack all these things that we do, our tools we roll out or whatever. Let's invite them to the party. So we now meet with them every month. We give them a mission. We're like, all right, so we're doing bug bounty. What's your concern? Here's everything. We're going to show you everything. We're going to open up the tools. We're going to dig in. So we gave them a whole bunch of knowledge that now made, and there's people from IT, a ton of people from IT. There's definitely people from legal that are in there. So that's the second one. I think that because of those two things, it took time. It probably took a year to get to a point that there's some trust. And I think that's where the biggest gap is that there's not trust from all the different realms, that you're doing something for the benefit of the company, for the benefit of the business, for the benefit of the customers, et cetera. When that trust starts to be obvious that that's what your intention is, it's a little different. We're all on the same side.
Yeah. I think something you said earlier reminded me of our prep call. Compliance does not necessarily mean security. And so I think sometimes in IT, at least in my experience, they say, well, we've gone through this checklist, or we had whatever third party come in and check boxes off and give us a report. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're secure. And I'll give you a story because I told them and I think it's great. And we're all in a hotel. So I had one breach. It was a boutique hotel that shall remain nameless for a few reasons. And we were going through the breach, and basically the entire network was infected. 30 plus computers of all their admin stuff, just terrible. And going through the breach, the in-house guy says, I just don't know how this happened. We're PCI DSS compliant. And I'm like, interesting. Let's look at that. And so we got the report, and it sure enough said, yep, all good. And we're like, we discovered something that you should be aware of that calls us into question. We found out that your payment card system was on the same network, not segregated at all, that your guest Wi-Fi was on. And so literally they had credit card numbers rolling through their network connection and also guest information. So
Is that bad? So we
give us a computer in 10 minutes and we'll show you how bad it is. So, I think you can have these, and there's, don't get me started on the PCI DSS compliance.
shots
Well,
at the bar later.
it's-
HIPAA at one point
That's
only
also-
needed
yeah.
you to actually notify of a breach if it was more than 500 records.
Yeah.
what about the 499 people?
Exactly.
Like, there's a real thin line about that kind of information,
Yeah.
what's getting out there and what you have to do and what those regulations are really getting you. But
Well, and again, to the last point on this slide, is, what IT decision makers think is what they're going to get out of something like a liability policy, where the costs come out of is to recover data and critical information. You don't necessarily get that with some of these policies. Some of these policies might only cover notification. If you have like a PCI clause, it's only for that and excludes a lot of other things. There seems to be a big disconnect there of what IT people think they're going to get out of having that type of risk transfer.
Yeah, and they're also sometimes not included in choosing a cyber policy. It could be from some other arm of the company that doesn't consult with them about what level of risk they need to cover. And to your point, and none of these policies are unified. Like, you have different providers of these policies that have wildly different clauses in them. And so depending on where you go,
Being explained to you by brokers who
being
are not,
brokers who know even less about the policy. And this is actually the thing I run into most is like brokers will, I'll give you another example. Company had $4 billion in assets. This is a breach that happened February this year. $4 billion in cash in the bank. Like, they had that much assets just in cash. And as I'm going through, I'm like, okay, what's your cyber policy look like?
Terrible
And they're like,
returns.
and so they sent it to me. And it was literally a $10,000 rider attached to their premises liability for their office. And that's it. And it was very short. It didn't really even go into what it covered, but it was such a small amount, it almost didn't matter. We used that within, 2 days, trying to investigate this and stop it. So, then they're like, well, now what? And I'm like, unfortunately, you have to pay. You just weren't adequately insured. So,
I mean, we have one right now where they blew through the forensics policy undoing IT restoration. The IT company billed out, got claimed coverage on it, and they said, do you have, we have $2,000, can you do the investigation of what was possibly taken? Like, well, they're going to get a checkbook out, because at this point, they were so focused on their response of getting a specific server set up, they blew through their policy.
yeah, and sometimes it doesn't cover remediation. Like, sometimes it will only cover investigation. Sometimes it won't include outside counsel. Sometimes it will. Sometimes it'll say who you have to use as outside counsel or other providers. So there's a lot. That's an entirely separate conversation. And it's hard because there's only a couple brokers I know that do it well.
Yeah.
I think that's changing slowly, but I mean, you guys must deal with this all the time with.
half of our business is insured,
Yeah.
So it's some unique challenges there, but we are finally starting to see them sort of pay attention to what's happening there. I'd be curious from your perspective, the pitch we use is always, look, you're either going to, pay me now or you're going to pay me later when it comes to a response, right? And it's the argument of, preventative and proactive versus the reactive, right? If guys like him and I are on the phone with you, you're paying later. And again, I'm a tiny component of that, but there's all these other costs that get involved. So even if you are insured, like you said, you never really know. It's a lot like my health insurance, I guess. I don't know what I've got until I break a leg, or like need a root canal. It's like, oh, we'll clean them. You're on your own for that crown. But in terms of the costs associated with just a small, I was about to say normal breach. I don't think I've ever seen, I don't know what to call normal breach anymore. But something small, like under $100,000, like a policy that would cover $100,000 worth of costs, what steps are actually paid for? Obviously, a $10,000 policy is getting you nowhere,
Yeah.
right? But where does that money go from your perspective? Because you're usually in,
Yeah.
or that's when the bills start racking up, I guess, is once the lawyers start getting
Well,
involved.
what I try to do, I mean, I don't want to talk about myself that much, but I try to minimize what's the effort to get to the question of, do we have a liability to report? That's my job, is what's the legal, what do we have to do legally? If you want to decide to fix all your systems, that's great. But my job isn't to tell you how to fix your systems. That's for the technical boots on the ground guys. If you want to do that, you can do that. But I think that the cost you have to watch out too, because I know you guys have probably also had to work with technical, like the forensic providers maybe, who like to boil the ocean and investigate everything, even though it's maybe not in scope. And it's like, well, okay, some of it might be justified, but then they're like, yeah, we want to image these another 150 computers. I'm like, why?
Why?
What do you
you don't
expect to
know
find?
what's on them.
Right.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
luckily
there's no
I
obligation to check everything.
Right. Let's
Comb
deploy.
the desert.
Yeah, deploy CrowdStrike or something, FireEye or something that can give
Find
us some
anything
idea.
yet?
Yeah,
Man, we
and
ain't
let's-
found.
So I think that's, a lot of the money gets burned with inefficiency, and I think the less of a plan you have, the more likely you have to burn through your insurance policy because it's inefficient.
That is a really strong point. I would absolutely second that. That is a really big problem.
What a great point to end on. I'm sure there's questions, and we're all here, or at least I'm here the rest of the day too. So if there's any questions now, I think we probably have time for like one-ish or two, but certainly around further questions after the session. Anybody have any thoughts, concerns?
I feel like only half the room got your Spaceballs reference.
I know, it's
Yeah.
all right.
I got it.
I'm used to it.
I used to drop a lot of My Cousin Vinny, and then
Talladega
just-
Nights.
We'll be shaked and baked then.
That's right.
All right,
right.
well, that's it.